For over 60 years, the United Nations has been working to reach a political settlement between the Greek and Turkish Cypriot communities and end the long-standing division of Cyprus. However, at the end of March, the leaders of the two communities, as well as representatives from Britain, Greece and Turkey, met in Geneva to try to kickstart new talks. But can they succeed, and what else can be done to try to bring the two communities closer together? To discuss all this, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Nasia Hadjigeorgiou and Fezile Osum, who've been working on an EU-funded project to look at the work of the technical committees in Cyprus. Perhaps, Nasia, we can jump straight in and you could just give us a little bit of an overview of where things stand with the talks. I mean, obviously we can go back sort of 50, 60 years. But we saw a major effort in 2017. Sort of perhaps you could give us a little bit of a context about what happened there and where we've gone since then.
Okay, so what happened in 2017 is disputed. It's contested on both sides. What we know is that the leaders failed to reach an agreement. The Greek Cypriots left. According to some, halfway through the negotiations, according to others, after the negotiations reached an impasse. The climate after the Greek Cypriots left the negotiations in 2017 was not a good one. After that, Greek Cypriots, Turkish Cypriots basically stopped talking to each other almost entirely, with some exceptions that we can talk about later in the form of the technical committees. And things have remained on ice until recently, which is what Fezile will go into in a minute. In the meantime, the Turkish Cypriots had elections. Mr. Tatar was elected in office. He is a proponent of a two-state solution, meaning that he's not in favor of a bizonal, bicommunal federation. And the Greek Cypriots also had elections a year later. And Mr. Christodoulidis came into office, who is on paper in favor of a bizonal, bicommunal federation, but was in the team of Greek Cypriot politicians who left the negotiations in 2017, which does raise some questions as to how sincere he is about his willingness to negotiate.
And what we've seen is, of course, the UN, there have been frequent calls for restart of talks, and we had the appointment of an envoy last year to sort of look into whether the conditions were right to do that. And what we've just seen in March is these talks in Geneva. Perhaps you could give us a bit of a sense of what the feeling was going into those and what the leaders agreed.
Yeah, of course. As Nasia said, so when Tatar came into power in the Turkish Cypriot community, it was something that was not that much expected in the community, I can say that. And the elections, there had been serious allegations of strong interventions by Turkey in the presidential elections in the Turkish Cypriot community. And when Tatar came into power, he said that he will no longer negotiate a federal model, but rather a two-state model. He stated this in his election campaign, actually, and I would like to say that it wasn't a popular thought amongst the Turkish Cypriot community, but yet he was elected. So what happened now, what we see all these years since 2020 that he was elected, we see that we have lost a lot of time. There were no formal negotiations. There are still no formal negotiations. We just had an informal meeting in Geneva, I think like roughly 2 weeks ago, and some major issues, not major, but let's say some useful issues were agreed on. So it was the opening of 4 crossing points, one of the points that was agreed on, something that I think the Cypriot people has been demanding for so long now. Demining was another issue, some initiatives on climate change and environment, and establishment of a new technical committee which will focus on youth. So we have now 12 technical committees that Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots work together. And now, if this one is established, we're going to have a 13th one, actually.
I'd certainly want to come back to the technical committees because, of course, this is something that you've both been engaged in this EU-funded project to look at. So, it would be something that it would be great to talk about. But it would be also interesting to get maybe a little bit of a sense of where you both see current attitudes within the respective communities about the talks process, about settlement, and about general engagement between the two communities. So perhaps, Nasia, you could give us a bit of a portrait of where you think things stand within the Greek Cypriot community.
I think that this is not a new phenomenon that I'm going to describe. It's something that we are increasingly seeing. People care less and less about the Cyprus problem. So, of course, the news reported what was agreed in Geneva, but it had absolutely no impact on people's everyday discussions, on people's expectations that the Cyprus problem will be resolved. And I think that has to do with fatigue of the population with the Cypriot problem. It has been an issue that is the number one issue on the political agenda for half a century, basically. And over the last 5 to 10 years, this is dropping in terms of importance. Now people care more about the cost of living. They care more about the traffic that we see in the country, electricity cuts that we see in the country, rather than the Cyprus problem as such. The second thing I wanted to say is that maybe one reason or one additional reason why people were not that bothered by what was agreed in Geneva is because we have heard all this before. I mean, the demining. The demining has been discussed and almost finalized for years now. A couple of years ago, the UN announced that it would be finished within that year. And now we hear that it hasn't been finished and it will now be finished. The technical committees, people don't really know much about them, but even those that do know that the Technical Committee on Youth is something that has been discussed for at least 3-4 years. So again, this is not massive news or a big breakthrough. The checkpoints, sure, the checkpoints are important, but again, they have been discussed for almost a decade. I mean, the checkpoints that we are discussing now are names that we have heard again and again and again. So I don't know if I'm being overly pessimistic, but I think this is, food that has been served before and has now just been reheated. And the people see this.
And I should say that, very much from a personal perspective, I mean, I think a lot of what you say resonates with me. I've sort of said before that I was off island during COVID, and the big thing that struck me was the last visit before COVID struck was really sort of sensed by, that sense of despondency amongst Greek Cypriots. And then when I came back after, I was really hit by the sense of apathy, that something had shifted over that time. And I think, that's really important. But Fezile, maybe you can also give some sort of indication for where you think Turkish Cypriots feel about where things stand.
Yeah, I mean, as a Turkish Cypriot, I can say that this is one of the most hopeless moments that I've ever experienced. Of course, I'm not that old, but I have been always engaged in politics since very young age. I can see that many people are detached from the Cyprus problem, as Nasia said. In the Turkish Cypriot community, we have been dealing with a heavy economic crisis as a result of Turkish politics. And this has got really worsened after the pandemic. We see very high inflation. Many people around my age, although they have around 10 years of experience, they can barely make a living. They cannot make any savings. They don't see any future. Younger people prefer to move abroad if they can. So we see that kind of tendency. We see that especially Turkish interventions in the domestic politics here in the Turkish Cypriot community has increased. We see that there is a new parliament building being established by Turkey, financed completely, even everything, the engineers and architects were all from Turkey, and right next to it is a really big mosque being established now, which this as a symbol is very important, I think, the message that it gives, because it's completely against the secular values of the Turkish Cypriot community, and it creates a lot of discomfort amongst the community. But also there is the sense of not feeling that empowerment anymore, not having that agency at all to say something, because people are extremely tired and people are, economically speaking, they're in kind of a survival mode, especially younger populations. So Cyprus problem is not high in their agenda anymore, which is very sad to see. But also for the Turkish Cypriot community, they don't see any other, solution or any other way out of this big crisis moment as well. So it's a very hopeless moment, let's say, for my community.
I think, and what you say, I think is one thing that I've really been struck with was that for many years, you would often have Greek Cypriots who would cross into the north. And the numbers actually, I think if we sort of say as a proportion of the overall Greek Cypriot population, have always been relatively low. It's always been more traffic coming the other way of Turkish Cypriots into the south or Republic. But what has struck me is that all the evidence seems to suggest that now it's more Turkish Cypriots who are even coming and shopping in Greek Cypriot shops, that they're finding it's actually cheaper than the north, which I think has been an incredible turnaround, that shaped things. But maybe we could talk a little bit about where things are going, because I think coming out of Geneva, one of the senses is that, is this a new approach to the Cyprus problem by the United Nations? And instead of maybe focusing solely on political leaders and trying to get a settlement at this stage, whether the UN is now sort of taking a slightly different approach and saying, look, one thing that has been neglected over the years is this people-to-people element of actually sort of building up that wider trust between Greek and Turkish Cypriot communities. And I know that you've been working on these technical committees. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about how these have operated within that broader context, and whether you think that maybe now we're going to see a little bit more emphasis on that. So, Nasia, maybe you could give some perspective on what are the technical committees for anyone who doesn't know.
Yes. So the first technical committees, as Fezile mentioned, there are 12 of them at the moment. The first technical committees were established back in 2008, and a second batch was established in 2015. Each technical committee is concerned with one thematic area. So there is a technical committee on education, another on health, another on cultural heritage, another on crime and criminal matters. And each of these committees consists of people who are appointed by the Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot community leader in their personal capacities in order to engage with members of the other community and bring about cooperation. The technical committees have a dual mandate. Their mandate being to promote trust building between the two communities by dealing with everyday issues that can no longer be ignored in light of the frozen conflict that we're experiencing. So theoretically, the technical committees should be finding projects which require bicommunal cooperation in order to be resolved adequately, and by adequately resolving them, promoting trust. And this is something that has been done. I don't want to be overly negative or pessimistic. This is something that many technical committees have been doing well for over 15 years now. Now, as to the second part of your question, is this new phase one that shows a shift in the UN's attitude? It's the resolution of the Cyprus problem, and are the technical committees the missing link that is going to bring everything together? I don't think so. Because the reason for that is this dual mandate of the technical committees. Let's address everyday issues and let's promote trust building between the two communities. The two mandates often go hand in hand. So often things go as planned, and by addressing everyday issues, we promote trust. But sometimes, in order to address everyday issues, technical committees have to do their work quietly. An example of that is the Technical Committee on Crime and Criminal Matters, which promotes cooperation between Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot police. And in order for that to work well, you need the two law enforcement agencies to work quietly with each other. So in order for the everyday issue to be resolved, trust building has to be ignored. And our research has shown that whenever there is a choice between trust building and addressing everyday issues, the technical committees choose addressing everyday issues. In other words, they are not effective trust-building mechanisms, and they shouldn't be, because by making them more visible, we are making them less productive. We need to have a clear idea of what the technical committees should be doing, and that is not contributing to the resolution of the Cyprus problem, at least not directly.
I mean, that's a fascinating point, because you would imagine exactly that you would want to be able to show what they're doing and being very open about it. And I guess this raises important questions, Fezile, about nature of transparency in this sort of process, and what you think the technical committees, given that there are these two things which can often, as you say, work hand in hand, Nasia, but might have an antagonism. I mean, maybe could you give us some sort of idea as to where you think the real successes have been of the technical committees? What have they delivered? Because if this isn't being lauded and trumpeted and everyone told about where the successes have been, I think, myself and many others would probably look at them and say, well, these are just talking shops. What have they actually done, which we can point to as real successes?
So as Nasia said, there have been really good projects that they have implemented that's sort of help with the day-to-day issues. To give example of the crime and criminal matters, just to give some numbers about that committee, between 2009 and 2023, they dealt with more than 4,000 criminal incidents together. So they collaborated, they exchanged information. And I can say that they have also in the past, although there are problems about extraditing suspects, they did also successfully extradited some of the suspects, which is very, very important, because we have seen a lot of cases that suspects are running from one side to another just to run away from the responsibilities. And so another very important example that I can give of is the cultural heritage, for instance. The health committee, the cultural heritage has been instrumental in regards to renewing the cultural heritage of the islands, the monuments, the religious venues like the church and the mosque on both sides. So they were really instrumental about that. And the health, for instance, have been very instrumental in regards to the COVID period, where we as the Turkish Cypriot community were suffering regarding access to vaccines. It was a really big problem. And the health committee have made that sort of collaboration with the Greek Cypriots, where the transfer from the south to the north of the vaccines could take place. It was very, very critical. Another very important project is, of course, Imagine project, which is unfortunately suspended by the current Turkish Cypriot leadership in 2022. By Ersin Tatar's team. But when it was suspended in 2022, so the Imagine project have already reached more than 5,000 students and also more than 700 teachers on both sides of the island, and gave them peace education, delivered peace education, organized workshops both monocommunally and also bicommunally in the buffer zone. Imagine project was something that we could really see the benefits of in terms of promoting this anti-racism, human rights values, peace education, which especially in the Turkish Cypriot community, the schools are not giving that sort of values or education. So, I mean, it was very important also to bring together the kids from both sides and teachers. So, I mean, the Imagine project, I think, was an incredible project. But unfortunately, when Ersin Tatar came into power, after a short time, his team suspended it, saying that it's against their two-state solution model, which had nothing to do with this Imagine project, had nothing to do with the settlement models, etc. And yeah, and then there are other, let's say, committees that I think that are important, but we haven't seen that sort of tangible outcomes coming in. I think the most important one could be the gender committee. And why it could be because, as you said, the transparency issues it's one thing. We see that technical committees are not that transparent, but the Cyprus problem as a whole, the settlement efforts have never been transparent. And there have been many people, many Cypriots demanding for transparency. And I think that's something that also contributes to where we are now, like basically not solving anything because we cannot really engage with the process as Cypriots. And women have always been absent. If you check the pictures from Geneva 2 weeks ago, you would see that there are only few women as well, and they are not in, they're just in like note-taking notes or secretary notes, secretary roles and stuff. So they're not in active roles to engage in these negotiations. It has always been like this. The Gender Technical Committee, one of its, let's say, mandates is to contribute to the settlement problem, to settlement process, to make suggestions, etc. So I think it could be really, really useful maybe to change the nature of this settlement process, if it is allowed to do so, of course. Until today, both in Mr. Akıncı's time, in previous term, and now with Ersin Tatar's term, we see that this committee have not been supported that much, and they had absolutely no power to influence the process. But there is a potential there, I think.
So this seems to present a much more positive picture in many ways, and I think on the outside. But I think certainly, if I might speak as a bit of a skeptic, I've always been worried about pursuing confidence-building measures in Cyprus, because there's very much a sense that questions of recognition are so central to any contact between the two communities, and that what you tend to find is very quickly you get into this amounts to recognition, and then you get a line. So it's almost like one step forward and two step back. And it almost strikes me that it would be far better to put all that energy into trying to get an overall settlement, because then you solve all those recognition issues overnight. And so I think CBMs and ideas of this have actually had quite a bad name in the history of the Cyprus talks. So how do you think we could see these committees sort of getting beyond that and actually showing people that there is a way forward, that there is stuff that can be done?
Yes. So if I can speak as an academic for a minute, there is this strand in the IR literature that talks about a concept called engagement without recognition. So how can the international community or a parent state engage with a de facto state on the one hand without recognizing that de facto state on the other? If I can say so, I think the technical committees are perfect examples of engagement without recognition, because what they are doing is precisely this, engaging, yet they have managed to square the circle by engaging without recognizing. So let me give you an example of how this has happened. This is my personal favorite, best practice of the technical committees. It is an example from the Technical Committee on Economic and Commercial Matters. Back in 2011, when there was an accident and there was a massive explosion next to an the biggest electricity production plant in the Republic of Cyprus, the Republic was faced with a very real possibility that it would be left without electricity for days. What it did at that stage was say, okay, we need to somehow find a way of getting electricity from the north, from the areas not under the effective control of the Republic. They had to buy that electricity, but they couldn't, the Republic couldn't be seen to be paying the TRNC, the areas not under the effective control of the Republic, because that was, as you said, that would be perceived as implicit recognition. Whether legally that would be implicit recognition or not is another subject. As a lawyer, I have questions whether paying someone amounts to recognition, but this was certainly the concern in the Republic. So what was done instead is the Republic gave money to the Greek Cypriot co-chair of the Technical Committee on Economic and Commercial Matters, who then gave this money to his Turkish Cypriot counterpart, who then gave the money to the Turkish Cypriot Electricity Authority. The electricity was transferred to the Republic of Cyprus without the Republic of Cyprus and the TRNC ever directly engaging. So it was a convoluted, if you want, process, but it was an effective one. And since then, since 2011, the two communities have shared electricity. They have undertaken infrastructure projects that have made the sharing of electricity possible, and they share electricity roughly once a year, a bit more than once a year. This electricity is mostly sent from the Republic of Cyprus to the areas not under its effective control. But in 2025, so 2 months ago in February, we had the second example where the Republic of Cyprus borrowed electricity from the north again. So this shows that, well, it shows a few things. Number one, it is impossible to work efficiently and effectively in a frozen conflict context unless you somehow engage with your neighbor, even if you don't recognize that neighbor. You need to find practical ways to address this recognition phobia that exists. And the second thing that it shows is that the technical committees have, not perfectly, but sufficiently done this.
I think the electricity was a fantastic example, but it sort of also brings me, water shortages are becoming a real problem amongst the Greek Cypriots. I mean, I was reading this morning that they're saying that the water levels are the lowest they've been since 2008. There's questions of desalination. Is this also an area, for example? I know that it's always been all of these issues are sensitive, but I know that this has been a sensitive area. Is this an area that could be worked on or is being worked on? But also maybe without wishing to put you on the spot too much, but areas which haven't been so successful or areas which have been completely missed up until now, where there is real room for new technical committees to emerge.
So there have been, of course, committees that have not been that active, or have not been done that useful projects. One example, as I said, is the gender one, for instance. Their existence is I think, very, very important, but they are not supported. But this was the case in the previous term as well. So we see that this committee was established in 2015, kind of to increase women's engagement with the peace process and also civil society engagement with the peace process, but have not done anything about it, like tangible, haven't had any tangible results. They announced an action plan in 2022 with Ersin Tatar and Christodoulidis, but that action plan is also not being implemented. So we see that action plan was done as a result of the efforts of the UN, especially because in each of the technical committees, we didn't mention that, but there is one person from the UN that facilitates this work of these technical committees. So as a result of this, I think that action plan was introduced. It was announced in the beginning. Civil society was really excited, but at the end, we haven't seen any tangible outcomes. So the process is still not transparent. We also had, for instance, as I said, the Education Technical Committee, when it was very active in the previous term until Tatar actually intervened with the work of that committee. It was very successful, mainly under this Imagine project and the amount of people that they have reached. But currently that committee is not that active anymore. So we see a direct result of how the leadership can affect these technical committees. We had another one on culture that have also done an incredible project in the previous term, but it's not that active anymore. So in the previous term, when Akıncı was in power, this committee actually facilitated the transfer of the artwork that remained in the north after the conflict. Very important and very important for Cypriot history, very important for Cypriot art, let's say, that sort of important art pieces. And then in return, from the south to the north, they have given the recordings of Turkish Cypriots, the TV records, the broadcasting back in the time in 1960s, back to the Turkish Cypriot community. So there was this sort of transfer between the two sides. And I think in order to facilitate this sort of thing, you need to also have trust. I think it was a great project to build that trust, sort of having this experience of giving back to each other, because we haven't done that in Cyprus that much. So creating the way of doing that was amazing. But again, we see that currently this committee is not really allowed to do this sort of projects anymore. So there is a lot of impact on technical committees. I want to also highlight that although they are very important tools, currently in our research, we have seen that especially the Turkish Cypriot members of these committees are feeling a lot of pressure from the Turkish Cypriot leadership, me as a researcher, I had a lot of bad times trying to reach out to these members and co-chairs and try to arrange some interviews. And many just did not reply, or some said openly that they are scared to speak. They're not allowed to speak even. So I think this is important to highlight at this point, that I think the technical committees has a lot of potential to change maybe how we see the settlement process. So this establishment of this new committee that's going to come up now with the youth has been demanded by the youth on both sides, actually, for many years now. And it's a result of this, because the youth wants to be engaged with the settlement process. That's why they wanted this technical committee. And right after it's announced, actually in the Turkish Cypriot community, 16 youth organizations came together and said that they are ready to work with Ersin Tatar to immediately establish this committee. So you see that the youth are really demanding it because they want to be a part of it. And we'll see if they will let them to do. I think symbolically, it's still very important to have a youth committee as well as gender, but we need to closely monitor if these committees will be actually allowed to produce some tangible outcomes.
And one other thing which I think would be really interesting is just to get a sense of how often the committees meet and what sort of size, what's the usual composition, but also that point about where you think as well things could be improved.
Okay, so let me start by addressing your previous question, the water shortage issue. This is something that theoretically could be addressed in a number of technical committees. Just like the Technical Committee on Economic and Commercial Matters dealt with electricity, it could deal with water shortages. Also, the Technical Committee on Education could deal with that. Sorry, the Technical Committee on Environment could deal with that, as well as the Technical Committee on Crisis Management. So the tools for dealing with water shortages are there. There doesn't seem to be sufficient political willingness to do it at the moment, and that is why none of these committees has taken any steps forward. I want to give another example where the technical committees could be doing more and they haven't, and this is the area of irregular migration coupled with human trafficking. Cyprus is topping the charts by far in terms of presumed human trafficking victims in the EU. Let me just give you a statistic. The latest EU statistics show that the EU average of presumed human trafficking victims is 22 people per 100,000 people. The UK, just by way of indication, is the second on this list, and it has 91 presumed human trafficking victims, and Cyprus, topping the chart, has 168. So we are talking about 6.5 times more human trafficking victims than the EU average. This is a direct consequence of the frozen conflict. It is because people are flying to a de facto state without realizing that they have no legal protections there, then trying to come to the Republic of Cyprus and being exploited in the process, or while they are in the TRNC. This is a problem. This is an issue that has very real consequences. Just last week, a Moldovan mother who was trafficked in the north died there. This is something that should be dealt with by the Technical Committee on Humanitarian Affairs, by the successful, otherwise very successful, Technical Committee on Crime and Criminal Matters, and it is not being picked up. So maybe we painted a rosy picture a few minutes ago. It is not without significant challenges, the operation of the technical committees. To go to your second question about the composition of the technical committees and how often they meet, this is something that I find particularly interesting about the technical committees, because I described them before as examples of engagement without recognition, but they are not a single example of engagement without recognition, right? They are 12 distinct examples of engagement without recognition, because each technical committee operates differently. Because it's an entirely informal body, it doesn't have any written rule. Each technical committee has shaped its practices and its composition based on what suits each committee best, which I think is a good thing. So We have technical committees that are small. For example, the Technical Committee on Crossings has 3 Greek Cypriots and 3 Turkish Cypriots as members, and the Technical Committee on Cultural Heritage has roughly 20 members, so much larger, and an additional 20-member advisory board. At some point, the Technical Committee on Education, now it's much smaller, but when it was properly active, it had a membership of 24 people, 12 Greek Cypriots, 12 Turkish Cypriots. So their size varies, as does the frequency with which they meet. So some technical committees are rather top-heavy, with the Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot co-chair doing most of the work. And these technical committees meet once a month, maybe less than that, but the co-chairs have daily contact. That would be the Technical Committee on Crime and Criminal Matters. And other technical committees meet weekly. The whole committee meets weekly. That would be the Technical Committee on Cultural Heritage. So again, different practices, different compositions, which as far as I'm concerned, works well because it is tailored to the needs of every thematic area.
And just as another quick technical question on the technical committees is this sort of, the people appointed, are they officials or deliberately not officials so that it doesn't create that recognition element?
So the appointment of the members of the technical committees is to the discretion of the leader of each community. Understandably, presumably because they had in mind what you have in mind, the Greek Cypriots have appointed either members of civil society or persons who are retired civil servants, retired diplomats, for example, retired heads of departments. But there are examples. One would be the Technical Committee on Broadcasting and Telecommunications, which needs direct communication with the current engineers working for the government, where the members are actually current civil servants, but they are appointed very clearly, and they repeat it every chance they get, in their personal capacities, not as civil servants. On the other hand, the Turkish Cypriots tend to appoint sitting civil servants, presumably in order to send the message that they are representing the TRNC in these internationally recognized, if you want, bodies.
It's obviously, I think, sort of, to sort of draw it more to an end is to now sort of think, where does all this go from here? Where you see where you see talks going. I think there does seem to be a sense of pessimism, notwithstanding what we saw in Geneva, and the sides will meet again in July to review progress and see where things, to stock take and see if the process can go forward in any way. But then we know that there's going to be elections in the Turkish Cypriot community later in this year. The first half of next year, Cyprus holds the rotating EU presidency. So there's a sort of sense that, we're probably not talking about getting into major talks for quite some time, potentially. So where do you see things going from here?
Yeah, so I think what Mr. Tatar is at the moment doing is trying to give the message that he's right in the last term of his presidency at the moment. In October, we're going to have the elections. So I think he's trying to give the message that he actually did some work on Cyprus problem, and he will try to show his voters that he strongly advocated for two-state solution model in Geneva and elsewhere. So he will try to use this to empower his voice and his voters, etc., saying that, you see, this is possible. We started voicing this loud, and in the future, things will change. This is what he will try to persuade people with. We'll see if it's going to work. As I told you before, Ersin Tatar was never a very popular politician in the Turkish Cypriot community, and he has came into power with a lot of support from Turkey and a lot of interventions. Now we'll see how much Turkey will intervene in the upcoming elections. We are very vulnerable to these interventions. We are a very small community, and we are isolated from the world, so we cannot really rely on anyone to protect our elections, let's say. So I am very, very worried about what's going to happen with these elections, because the last time we have seen a really heavy intervention, it was documented. but nothing happened. Still, he is in power. It's been like 5 years now, and we have lost a lot of time. I don't think that Mr. Tatar will change his position in the close future. I think the negotiations will keep on, maybe in an informal manner, like they have agreed on right now, and then everyone will wait what's going to happen in October. And if we see another Tatar term, I really don't know what to say. And of course, Tatar is also very much open to what Turkey will say, right? So Turkish position is also critical here. So if Turkey would be willing to go back to the federal model, I don't think that Mr. Tatar will say no or will be, able to resist. So at the moment, it seems like he is in line with what Turkey thinks, what Turkey pushes for. And in the future, we will see how Turkey will use the Cyprus issue. Now, Turkey is very complicated at the moment. There are a lot of issues going on internally.
Yes.
I think many things are depending on that as well. Turkey is in a threshold at the moment. I am very worried about what that will bring as well. So I think it is very much dependent on Turkish foreign politics as well.
And Nasia, how about you? How are you seeing things?
Well, I hate to sound pessimistic again, but on this, I think that the ship has sailed. I'm truly sorry to say this, but I don't think there are any more opportunities to comprehensively resolve the Cyprus problem. I think the last opportunity was missed in 2017, and unlike most or some political analysts who see this as a new attempt or a new way of resolving the Cyprus problem, what I see it as is a new way of normalizing the status quo, of saying this is the reality that you guys have to live with until you separate, you go your separate ways forever, right? So I'm being not very clear because this is, a personally triggering issue for me, but I think that what is going to happen is we're going to stay as we are for the foreseeable future, and at some point the TRNC will be recognized and we will end up with Mr. Tatar's preferred solution, a two-state solution. Now, that is not my preferred solution, but I think it is what is most likely to happen on the island.
I'd love to be able to end on a more positive note for all sorts of reasons. I think all three of us probably share sort of views on this. But look, in the meantime, thank you so much to both of you for talking to me about the work of the technical committees, about where we stand on the talks, and where things can go on this. And perhaps we can revisit discussion at some point soon. But until then, Nasia, Fezile, thank you so very much for the conversation today.